Marble steps are cool at dawn. Olive leaves still hold the night. Smoke is curling slow and thin. Names I whisper to the light. Sing, oh, sing to the stones and sky. Let the old words rise. Let the old words rise.
Hvad så, folkens? Welcome back to another video. We are heading into part 9 of Rise of Augustus. So last episode we kind of saw what would be probably pretty crippling to Mark Antony. His extremely failed invasion of Pavia. It did not go well because he kind of lost all of his supplies in an ambush while he was besieging a Parthian city. So kind of a neighboring kingdom, capital to Parthia. So yeah, and Armenia didn't really help the situation that much. So yeah, I'm pretty curious to think about, like, if Caesar had let this, would it have gone better? I think it might have, honestly. But again, Mark Antony's strategy wasn't that bad. So yeah. We also saw the end of Sextus. We don't really know what's gonna happen to him, if he's just gonna stay in Syria or something and just chill for the rest of his life. Lepidus was kind of screwed over. I kind of think that Lepidus was pretty fair in what he did. Like, he was the one who did most of the work in Sicily, and he just wanted his keep, and Octavian kind of just destroyed that. So yeah, but at least Octavian, it doesn't seem like Octavian actually killed Lepidus. He got to be pretty old. I think it was 76. So good for him, at least. So yeah, we also kind of got like some insight into like how biased the sources of this time period were. Right? Like, there's a lot of the authors or historians of this time was pretty biased towards the political power. So yeah, I kind of get that too. But it sucks. I do wish we would have some more foreign sources that perhaps we could match with, like, as an example, Parthian sources. But I don't know if, with that region, I don't know if those sources would survive to this day. I don't really know, because like, I think I heard something about the Mongols also invading that area and burning down the library or something. It was some big library they invaded and burned, from what I understand. I heard that somewhere before. Somebody talked about like the Mongols invading Iran or Iraq and burning down the library. So yeah. But yeah, I'm curious to see like what is Antony going to do now, and who kind of sparks the conflict between Octavian and Antony, because they're both pretty good at stirring up trouble, and now that Lepidus is gone, there's really no mediator between them anymore. It's just these two, and they are always ready for a conflict with one another. Like, whenever these two are in the same room, it always ends up in war, not discussion. So I'm pretty curious to see what's going to happen now. So yeah, let's get to it.
First question we need to consider is what Antony attempted to achieve. Historian Kenneth Jones, for example, has argued that Antony was far more successful than he is usually given credit for. In his interpretation, Antony's aim was much less extravagant. He only wanted to invade Media Atropatene and force the Median king into a client-king relationship, thereby weakening Parthia indirectly and improving Antony's position in the east. This, Jones argues, is why Antony rushed for Frater, where much of the Median royal family was. Moreover, Jones claims that the Parthians were somewhat reluctant to get heavily involved, citing as evidence the lack of an all-out Parthian attack on Antony's main force, and their allowing Antony to cross back into Armenia without attacking.
The Parthians should have been able to muster up a way bigger force than what they did. So, yeah, kind of get it.
The campaign was therefore largely a Roman-Median affair, with the Parthians only committing enough to defend their ally, but not enough to wipe out the Romans. The fact that Antony was claimed as imperator by his own men, and that the Median king would indeed abandon Parthia and side with Antony, are all cited as evidence that Antony was successful, even if costly, and the idea that his campaign was a failure is largely the result of Augustan propaganda. It is certainly an interesting theory, and one that should not be discarded lightly, but there are some compelling arguments against it. Sherwin-White claims that the campaign was, in fact, intended to conquer Parthia. Caesar's planned campaign...
Plus, what's becoming a client of Rome? Would that really help them? Because, like, Rome is all over here. Like, and this is, like, the most eastern area of their territory. But, like, Parthia could easily just keep fighting them, then, like, it would honestly have been a terrible position to be in. I'm shocked that Armenia is still existing when they're so close to Parthia and have close relations to Rome.
Against the Parthians, which Antony seems to have used as a blueprint to some extent, was due to be a campaign of conquest, and the numbers that Antony amassed were similar to those planned by Caesar. If Antony only wanted to intervene in Media, why the need for such a large army?
That is true.
Secondly, the lack of a major battle does not inherently imply a lack of Parthian interest. It may well have been the case that the Parthians were simply confident that enough damage could be done to the Romans without needing to risk a pitched battle. The reality is perhaps somewhere in the middle. Antony likely did plan to have a long-lasting campaign against the Parthians, starting with an intervention into Media. When the campaign began poorly, Antony mitigated his objectives, and therefore later claimed victory, having moved the goalposts. Syme's evaluation that it was a defeat but not a disaster is perhaps the fairest summary. While Antony had been defeated in the east, Octavian had finally prevailed in Sicily, chasing Sextus Pompey from the island and effectively ousting Lepidus. The last son of Pompey had fled to Militene with a few soldiers, where he awaited Antony's...
So Sextus got to Antony after the Parthian campaign. Interesting.
Return from the east. Upon hearing of his defeat, Sextus tried to send messengers to the Parthians, while Antony sent a lieutenant, Titius, to offer Sextus mercy if he joined Antony. An offer...
So wait, Sextus didn't just join Antony, he tried to plan another invasion with the Parthians. Dude, take the loss. Damn. Sextus doesn't take the L, so damn.
That Sextus delayed responding to. Antony's officers in Asia Minor grew wary of Sextus and began maneuvering to encircle him. In a last desperate gamble, Sextus took the city of Lampsacus through treachery and pressed thousands of its citizens into his army. Using this force, Sextus attacked targets of opportunity around Ionia, eventually taking Nicaea and Nicomedia.
Okay, just kill him. Like, this idiot.
Eventually, though, Antony was able to send a proper army to confront Sextus, including 120 ships, while Sextus burnt his fleet and armed his sailors, preparing to make his last stand. The nobles that were with him, including his father-in-law, Libo, though, had finally had enough, Rather than join Sextus in his desperate last stand, they defected to Antony's side. Sextus attempted to flee with his men to Armenia, but was hounded by forces under Titius, the governor of Asia Minor, Furnius, and the allied king of Galatia, Amyntas. Despite managing to inflict some casualties by night attacks, Sextus's supplies were cut off, and his ragtag force was stranded. His men began to desert him, and Sextus was finally left alone, and at last captured. The last son of Pompey the Great was executed months later in Militene after having fought Caesar, Antony, Octavian, and Agrippa for roughly a decade. In popular retellings of the civil wars, Sextus is often sidelined compared to the bigger players. However, it's worth bearing in mind how close Sextus had come to succeeding. In 39 BC, he was in an incredibly strong position militarily, and his blockade of Italy had effectively brought Rome to its knees. Just like his father, however, the political interests of his allies had been his undoing, and the moment had slipped through his hands. Though he was ultimately unsuccessful, one cannot help but admire his stubbornness and tenacity, and one wonders how different things would have been if Octavian did not have the fortune to have a commander as talented as Agrippa on his side.
That is true. Octavian would have been screwed in Sicily if it hadn't been for Agrippa. Like, Octavian was absolutely useless in that war. So, yeah, that is kind of true. But after the war, Sextus should just try to, like, help Anthony and then try to gain more power. Instead, he just decides to take, like, a couple of guys with him and try to piss off Antony and make friends with the Parthians again. And it's just, like, that's just stupid. Like, play your game properly or don't play. Like, this is just stupid.
More than a decade after Caesar crossed the Rubicon, his heir and his right-hand man were the only two major players left standing. An out-and-out conflict between Antony and Octavian had been largely avoided for years, replaced by proxy wars and political maneuvering. Both men had been able to claim that they were acting in accordance with Caesar's legacy, and could legitimize their wars as being necessary for the stability of the Republic. The destruction of the last remnants of the Pompeian faction and the sidelining of Lepidus meant that, in theory, the ultimate goal of the civil war had been achieved. Caesar had been avenged, and the Republic was fully under the control of the Caesarians. In reality, though, all that had been achieved was the removal of the final buffers separating the two. The last great civil war of the Roman Republic, to decide who would be the master of Rome, loomed on the horizon. The end of 36 BC had seen Octavian build upon his position by completing the conquest of Sicily from Sextus Pompey, and then ousting Lepidus and absorbing many of his powers and legions into his own. Antony, meanwhile, had fared poorly in his Parthian campaign, and returned to Alexandria to regroup. Both men were aware that with Lepidus out of the equation, a direct confrontation was inevitable and began consolidating their positions. In the west, Octavian launched a series of campaigns along the Adriatic coast against the Pannonians in 35 BC, whom Cassius Dio, an eventual governor of the area, describes as leading the most miserable existence of all mankind, but also as the bravest of all men of whom we have knowledge. The details regarding the campaign are rather minimal, and it seems to have been over rather quickly, with Octavian successfully taking the city of Siscia and leaving a subordinate, Geminus, to govern the area. A year later, Octavian and Agrippa would launch a similarly quick yet successful campaign in Dalmatia. While there is again little information about this conflict, the most important detail is that in both instances, Octavian and Agrippa fought a campaign on both land and sea, giving their army and navy crucial experience that would prove invaluable in the coming years. Meanwhile, in the east, Antony set his plans in motion to avenge himself on the Armenian king Artavasdes, who had deserted him so early during the campaign in Atropatene. In the following years, Antony made numerous attempts to lure the Armenian king out of his kingdom and to Alexandria, but Artavasdes was a cautious man and refused the invitations. At last, in 34 BC, after many bribes, envoys, and other means, Antony was able to convince Artavasdes to meet him. When he did, Antony immediately had him seized and imprisoned, and moved all of his 16 legions into Armenia. The details for this campaign are again vague. There seems to have been some resistance, led by Artavasdes' son, but there does not seem to have been any large-scale battles. Rather, Antony's intervention in Armenia seems to have been more like a raid, intended to remind the locals of Rome's supremacy and the cost of going against her, rather than a war of conquest. Simultaneous to these military affairs, Antony and Octavian were both making moves politically. With Lepidus out of the picture, Octavian targeted his formidable propaganda machine squarely on Antony and Cleopatra. A crucial figure in this, and one often sidelined in discussions of the time period, was Octavian's sister Octavia. She had already played an important role in Octavian's career, cementing the triumviral alliance in 40 BC by marrying Antony, and had been a crucial go-between for the two triumvirs, helping to negotiate the treaty and promises of mutual support in 37 BC. Moreover, Octavia was renowned in Roman society as a paragon of wife and motherhood. In 35 BC, in the aftermath of the Atropatene campaign, Octavia had headed east with gifts for Antony, and according to some sources, 2,000 of the 20,000 men that Octavian had promised to Antony. Rather than meeting her in Greece, however, Antony sent her a letter telling her to stay in Athens, while he himself went to Alexandria. Octavian and his allies leapt upon the scandal, arguing that it clearly showed Antony's allegiances lay with a foreign queen rather than the most ideal Roman wife. In the autumn of 34 BC, in Alexandria, Antony carried out a kind of triumph to mark his success in Armenia, riding through the streets on a chariot and parading the Armenian king in his procession. In the end, according to the sources, Antony and Cleopatra sat upon ornate oriental chairs, with Antony dressed in Eastern garb as Dionysus and Isis. It was here that Antony supposedly made his infamous donations. In front of a large crowd, Antony purportedly recognized Caesarion as the legitimate heir to Julius Caesar, and proclaimed him King of Kings, while Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings, and gifted the lands of Egypt and Cyprus. Moreover, the children...
Caesarion, was that the alleged son of Caesar and a Cleopatra? Damn.
Children of Antony and Cleopatra were all also given land, the yet-to-be-conquered Armenia, Media and Parthia to Alexander, Cyrenaica and Libya to Selene, and lastly Syria, Phoenicia and Cilicia to Ptolemy. Antony apparently went so far as to send dispatches to Rome to repeat the proclamation to the Senate and get their approval of it, although the consuls at the time, Gaius Sosius and Domitius Ahenobarbus, both loyal friends of Antony, refused to allow the proclamation to be read, knowing how damaging it would be, much to these donations remain a topic of some debate among historians to this day. It must be remembered, after all, that the surviving sources for this period are largely pro-Octavian, with some of them being based directly on Octavian's own memoirs, and thus presenting the narrative that Octavian wanted to present. Some, such as Halfman, argue that Antony was embracing his complicated mixed role of being both a Roman and a kind of Hellenic dynast, and perhaps articulating what his later vision for the East was. In this interpretation, Antony was not actually promising to hand over land to Cleopatra or her children, but would have placed them as more symbolic rulers of the areas, while existing client kings would be kept in power but subordinate to Cleopatra and Caesarion. Others say that the proclamation was meant purely for a local audience, a declaration to the Alexandrians specifically that he would aim to restore the Ptolemaic Empire to its previous glory, and that the donations were simply a rhetorical device. Finally, there are those, such as Patterson, who doubt how realistic the episode is entirely.
Really?
Antony was a talented politician, and well aware of the importance of public opinion. So is it really believable that Antony, in the midst of repairing his reputation after his defeat in Parthia, would make such an obviously disastrous and poorly judged move as the donations? After all, even if Antony did not intend to give over the land directly, and intended the titles to be more symbolic, it was still a slight to the famously anti-monarchist Romans and other allied monarchs. Patterson instead argues that some aspects are likely true, such as Antony proclaiming Caesarion to be Julius Caesar's true heir, and proclaiming Caesarion and Cleopatra as king and queen of Egypt, both of which would be sensible and logical steps for Antony to take.
Yeah.
The other donations, particularly those to Antony and Cleopatra's own children, could very well be fabrications of Octavian's propaganda. Almost all, however, agree that Antony did confirm Cleopatra as queen of Egypt and Caesarion as Julius Caesar's heir, thereby establishing...
that also does make sense. Like, Cleopatra is the ruler of Egypt, and Caesarion is said, allegedly, Caesar's son. So, yeah, that does make sense. Plus, making Caesarion the successor of Caesar also takes away the grandeur of Octavian, so...
pushing him as a direct rival to Octavian, and further increasing tensions between the two. News of these affairs, true or false, soon reached Rome and was quickly capitalized on by Octavian, who attacked Antony as being bewitched by Cleopatra and scorning Roman values by his style of dress and actions.
Damn.
It is something of an irony that the Octavian propaganda focused on Antony's style of dress and hair, when these same arguments had been used against Octavian's...
they're trying to say that he's not Roman. That Cleopatra is kind of turning him Greek or Egyptian.
...father Caesar to demonize him. In retaliation, Antony accused Octavian of being a tyrant, removing Lepidus from the triumvirate without Antony's approval, and taking all of Lepidus's legions and Sicily for himself, rather than splitting them. Octavian in turn accused Antony of retaining control over Egypt instead of giving it to the Senate to distribute, murdering Sextus, and dishonorably tricking the Armenian king. Meanwhile, Octavia, who had returned from Athens and was living in Antony's home in Rome, was using her position to strengthen Octavian further.
Ooh.
As Antony's wife, it was her responsibility to handle his affairs in his absence, including dealing with Antony's clients, many of whom she subtly moved into her brother's pocket, chipping away at Antony's support structure in the city.
Damn.
Indeed, Octavia had been so useful to Octavian's political campaign that historian Barry Strauss credits her with having done as much for the House of Caesar as any military commander. While Octavia was rather subtle and cunning in turning people against Antony, other agents of Octavian were less so. Calvisius, for example, spread still more rumors about Antony, that he had given hundreds of thousands of books to Cleopatra, that he read love notes from her while dealing with foreign kings, that he once left in the middle of a gripping lecture after seeing Cleopatra passing by, and escorted her instead of staying to hear the speech, and shockingly gave Cleopatra a foot rub at a banquet. Most of these were dismissed as baseless slander, however, and though Octavian had eroded some of Antony's base, he still did not have enough cause to openly declare war against Antony. In order for that to happen, he would need some far more serious and damaging information. Fortunately for Octavian, such information soon presented itself. Among the numerous people who defected to Octavian were two men in particular, Marcus Titius and Lucius Manatius Plancus. Both men had fought under Antony, Plancus during the Perisine War and Titius during the Atropatene campaign. Why exactly they now betrayed Antony is unclear. Opportunism, bribes, or a fracturing of their relationship with Antony are all possibilities.
Yeah.
Whatever the case was, they brought with them information that was useful to Octavian. Most importantly, some details regarding Antony's will. Encouraged by their words, Octavian determined to see the will himself, and ordered his men to seize it from the Vestal Virgins where it had been stored, a grossly blasphemous act. Octavian must have known how sacrilegious this would be, but considered this a price worth paying for the information. Gathering the Senate together, Octavian read the will aloud, in which Antony had supposedly reaffirmed the legitimacy of Caesarion, promised yet more land to Cleopatra and her children, and worst of all, requested to be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome. Once again,
This gotta be a fake will, right? Like, there's no way that Octavian would take the chance of, like, angering so many people by breaking the law like that. And then risk, like, this will is just some basic will with, like, hey, I'm gonna give this money to this person or something like that. Like, this could easily have backfired. He gotta have manipulated this with a fake will or something. He gotta have done that, like 100%. So yeah, I'm gonna take that will with a pretty big grain of salt here.
It is hard not to think that Octavian fabricated many of the details. Antony's will was very likely entrusted to the Vestal Virgins, but it is incredibly unlikely that he had committed to writing such politically damaging ideas if he ever actually had them.
Yeah.
As Aeschylus has written before, though, in war, truth is the first casualty. It did not matter if the contents were true or not. What mattered was that they were believed. To many, the will seemed to legitimize many of the worst accusations made against Antony and Cleopatra, namely that Antony intended to rule Rome as a Hellenic-style monarch, with Cleopatra at his side. It was a significant blow to Antony's reputation, and it was enough for Octavian to weaponize the Senate against him. Declaring that Antony's actions were all the result of Cleopatra, Octavian had the Senate declare war against Cleopatra. This was an important detail. By declaring war on...
So it's not a civil war, it's a war to protect Rome against Cleopatra and her womanly instincts.
Cleopatra, Octavian could avoid calling it another civil war. He could portray himself as a Roman fighting a threatening foreign power.
Yeah.
And he forced Antony into a position where he would...
It's easier to get people to follow you when you say that this is a war against a foreign hostile power, not a civil war against fellow Romans.
To actively align himself with Cleopatra and against Rome. As Octavian knew he would, Antony announced his support for Cleopatra and was subsequently labelled a traitor and stripped of all his powers and authority, leaving Octavian as the only man with full, legitimate triumphal powers. While many senators sided with Octavian, a good many, including the two consuls for the year, Ahenobarbus and Sosius, viewed Octavian as a tyrant, and threw their lot in with Antony, fleeing to the last war of the Roman Republic had begun. While the propaganda war had been raging, Antony and Cleopatra had moved to Ephesus near the end of 33 BC, where they began mustering their forces. Pulling together all their resources in the east, they had put together a colossal force of 500 warships, 300 supply ships, and 120,000 soldiers. The navy was mostly triremes and quinquiremes, also called threes and fives respectively, but they also had a few heavier ships, ranging from 6s to 10s. These ships, thanks to their large size, were somewhat ineffective in naval battles, and were instead designed to smash the defences of fortified harbours, such as those at Brundisium and Tarentum. Though no source confirms it directly, the inclusion of these kinds of ships, as well as the size of the army, strongly implies what Antony and Cleopatra had planned, a full-scale invasion of Italy. With this kind of force, such a feat was certainly possible, but would be a huge logistical challenge. After all, alongside the 120,000 soldiers, their navy would have consisted of a further 200,000 men. The key to their success would be maintaining a strong supply line from Egypt to their front lines in Greece, and then on.
Why then not attack like Africa and Sicily and have an even stronger supply line to again hold Italy hostage?
Italy. Already, though, some cracks were starting to emerge. Ahenobarbus and Sosius both implored Antony to send Cleopatra back to Egypt. Both were respected men, and Ahenobarbus in particular had proved himself as a talented admiral, having commanded fleets in the Adriatic for the liberators against the Triumvirate decades earlier. Both men considered the reputational damage of Cleopatra to be too much, especially if they were to invade Italy. It would all seem to confirm Octavian's propaganda if the invading force landed with...
Yeah, that is true. Antony and his powers needs to kind of make sure that this is seen as a civil war Octavian has started. But that won't work if they have a foreign queen with them, because then it will look like an Egyptian invasion of Italy. And then they can lose a lot of support and political protections. And Octavian will literally just get what he wants, so... Yeah.
a foreign queen at their head.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, Antony had a good reason for keeping Cleopatra with him. She
Really?
was providing the vast majority of the funding for the campaign, as well as 60 of the warships, all of which Antony desperately needed to keep on hand. Moreover, sending Cleopatra away may have potentially alienated other allied monarchs. Cleopatra also had her own reasons for wanting to stay. Not only that she had already invested heavily into the expedition, but there was always the threat that Octavian could offer to repair the marriage of Octavia and Antony, leaving her isolated. In the end, Cleopatra, with the help of some well-placed bribes to other officers close to Antony, was able to convince him of her usefulness, and the force sailed for Greece in the late summer of 32 BC. Their army and navy were large and well supplied, and they had far more funds than Octavian did, all of which tipped the scales in their favor. However,
All right. Damn. Things escalate pretty quickly. Damn. All right. Yeah. I think it was a pretty interesting thing. Was it Plutarch or who was it that said it? A Greek author that said that the first casualty of war is the truth, and that's 100% true. Yeah, I don't really go into like modern things about war, but I usually don't follow it because it's always heavily biased. The main thing I like when I watch like the news is like figuring like different wars and stuff. The only thing I really take in is okay, there's a war here, and then I stay out of it because like everyone is extremely biased, and it's the same thing back then. Like I always take those things with a grain of salt, especially like the specifics of history. I just mainly I can't just take in like, okay, this happened at this time period. So I don't really go into specifics after that because you don't really know if what you're hearing is true, and then it's just wasted knowledge, wasted space in your head. So, yeah. Damn. This is going to be an interesting war. I'm curious to see how this is going to end. How Octavian is going to win this war, I have no idea. Like, Antony has a massive army, massive supplies. He has important territories. I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see in the next part. So, yeah. Whew. The original video will be down in the description, guys. If you guys want to check out some more history videos, I'll have a playlist up on the screen. Otherwise, see you guys later. Bye.
Bare feet in the furrowed ground, dust on my tongue, heat bearing down, sun like a hammer on my back, name I was born with, they took that. But my chains flow soft like water, running through this tired soul. You can bind my hands together, you can't cage what rivers know.